Duck kept the yard running smoothly. The coaches admired his gentle shunting. The freight cars behaved themselves, and trains were always ready to time. "Shipshape and Sweden fashion," Duck would say. The engines were impressed. Sir Topham had even more so. "You've proved yourself a most dedicated engine," he said grandly. "Perhaps you could be of assistance outside of the yard too." So Duck soon found himself making occasional excursions along the main line, doing odd jobs when required, a position which gave him great pride. "Not to say that it's wrong having little Duck out and about," murmured Henry. "He does work hard after all. But it's not the done thing, having little tank engines playing about on the main line," finished Gordon loftily. "Is that so?" came a voice. "Then perhaps, if you feel that way, Gordon, you could take my freight cars for me. I'm sure it could be arranged," Duck added sweetly. Gordon was horrified at such a notion. Henry found it hard to contain his laughter. A few days later, a line of empty vans was needed at Edward Station. Duck was delighted to take them. Whilst he enjoyed the main line in full, he liked visiting Edward Station best of all. He ambled gaily along, the vans rumbling obediently behind. "You look cheerful," smiled Edward when at last the little train reached its destination. "It is good to see you again." "Oh, indeed," beamed Duck. But before he could say another word, the air was filled with a thunderous noise. With a rattle and a roar, and a bellow of his whistle, Gordon and the express tore past. It rattled by with such force, Duck thought he might get blown over. "There's someone in high spirits," grinned Edward. "I can't help but think he's trying to show me up," murmured Duck, "a display of what a proper mainline engine looks like." Edward raised an inquisitively eyebrow, so Duck quickly explained about the others as he tied his vans away. When he had finished, Edward grinned once again. "Some engines never change. I wouldn't pay them any mind." "Oh, don't worry. I know better than to fret over silly little things," Duck winked. The two engines laughed and chatted as quickly as they could before it was time for Duck to leave. But he hadn't long started away before he spotted a red signal up ahead. "Hello," called the driver. "I wonder what the matter could be." Duck drew to a halt beside the box as the cinnamon leaned out to them. "There is trouble at the next station," he called. "Gordon's safety valve has burst. Relief is on its way, but they've asked if you can shut Gordon out of the way." Duck couldn't help but smirk. "Right away, sir," he whistled as he scampered away. When he arrived, he found Gordon in a pitiful state. He stood short of the platform, staring meekly at his buffers. The buzz of angry passengers erupted from the coaches. Duck quickly ran around the train and was coupled to Gordon. He pulled the big engine away to the yard in silence, and stood with him as Henry rode into view. The passengers cheered, and in no time at all, Henry was coupled to the train, and away, whistling cheekily to Gordon as he passed. Duck couldn't help but feel sorry for the big engine, but all the same, he couldn't resist himself. "It's not the done thing, playing about on the main line, is it, Gordon?" Gordon said nothing. He just brooded in a bitter silence.
Bertie the bus has worked along Thomas's branch line for a very long time and is proud to be a part of the line. The engines know they can rely on Bertie, and he knows he can rely on them. Bertie is an essential part of the smooth running of the line. He wouldn't want to be anywhere else, but there was another bus who ran along the line. Algy was another red bus, but he was more modern than Bertie and full of his own ideas. He was very immature and was always in trouble with the bus manager. The engines and passengers weren't very impressed with his attitude. He was originally purchased to help with the mainline bus connections, but had caused so many issues that the bus manager decided to swap Bertie's route for Algy's. Bertie didn't mind the change of scenery at first, but he did miss the branch line. However, he worked hard and was never late. The same can be said for Algy. One crisp morning, the bus manager came to speak with Bertie and Algy. "I've been hearing nothing but good things about your service on the mainline route, Bertie, so you will have a repaint this morning." "Oh, thank you, sir," beeped Bertie. He wasn't repainted often, so it was always a nice surprise for him. Algy, however, was green with envy. "It's not fair. Bertie always gets special treatment, whereas I only get yelled at." The bus manager turned and pointed at Algy. "I do not play favourites, Algy. Bertie has earned his keep and his reward. Perhaps if you didn't receive so many complaints from your passengers, you'd be repainted too." The bus manager then returned back to his office, leaving a very angry Algy behind. His mood didn't improve when the painters arrived and began their work on Bertie. "I thought the point of a repaint is that you're painted a new colour. Why do you always pick red?" grumbled Algy. "I think red suits me. Don't you like your red paint?" "Absolutely not. People keep mistaking me for you," sniffed Algy. "Well, if you could be repainted, what colour would you choose?" went on Bertie. Algy thought for a moment, but he couldn't decide on a colour, so he went back to grumbling until his driver came to start work. Later, Algy was dropping off passengers for Thomas, but he was still moaning. "You know, I used to shunt trains back at the big station for the other engines. I understand exactly how you feel," said Thomas kindly. "But after I helped out with a rescue, the fat controller rewarded me with this branch line." Just then, the guard blew his whistle and Thomas had to go. "Goodbye, Algy. Keep your steam up. You'll get your chance soon." Little did Thomas or Algy realise he'd get his chance much sooner than expected. Along Thomas's branch line there is a siding with a set of buffers next to a signal. This siding is used to store trucks if the yards at Elsbridge are full. It is vital that the signalman set the points correctly to keep trains on the right line. Today, however, the points were set at the siding, as the signalman was rather distracted with his newspaper. Thomas swerved over the points with Annie and Clarabelle. He didn't notice anything at first until he spotted the buffers. "Cinders and ashes!" cried Thomas as his driver shut off steam and applied his brakes. Thomas skidded along the track before colliding with the buffers, his front wheels leaving the rails. Thanks to Thomas's driver's quick thinking, no one had been hurt, but the passengers just had a nasty shock. The crew and guard helped the passengers off the train. Annie and Clarabelle's buffers felt rather sore. Not as sore as Thomas's. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" sang Annie and Clarabelle sadly. Just then they heard a rumble of an engine coming from the road. The guard flagged Algy down. "Are you alright, Thomas?" asked the concerned bus. "I think so. Do you think you could take my passengers to the next station?" puffed Thomas. Algy agreed to help. It was rather a tight squeeze for the passengers, but they arrived safe and sound at the station. Algy's driver then raised the alarm for Thomas and called for the replacement bus for Thomas's passengers. Another bus came in no time. The passengers thanked Algy and his driver profusely. The young bus had never received so much praise. We'll tell our friends how reliable and helpful Sodor roadways are, they called to Algy as they were driven away, which made Algy beam. The next morning, Algy awoke to see Bertie smiling at him. I heard about your rescue yesterday. I'm very impressed with you. I'm sure manager will be too, cheered the red bus happily. Do you think so? Asked Algy. Absolutely, called a voice. The two buses looked over. It was the bus manager and the fat controller. I'm very happy with you, Algy. You've done our company proud, said the manager with feeling. And if it wasn't for you, Thomas and his passengers could have been stranded for hours. I'm glad I can rely on this fine company to help with the running of my railway, added the fat controller. Algy blushed. He didn't know what to say. The manager then raised his finger. I think you've earned your original responsibility back, so you'll be back working on the main line route this afternoon, once you are repainted first. Main line? Repainted? Oh, thank you, sir, beeped Algy happily. When the painters arrived, they showed Algy all the colours he could choose from. The poor bus couldn't decide. He took so long trying to pick one that Thomas arrived with his passenger train. He stopped at the signal and whistled to Algy. Thank you for the rescue yesterday. That signalman won't be reading newspapers for quite some time. The two vehicles chuckled. Algy then looked at the tank engine all over. He then looked at the painters and smiled. I'd like to be painted blue, please, like my dear friend Thomas, as a way of thanking him for his advice. Thomas whistled happily as the painters set to work. Algy was delighted to get the red paint off. Algy is a very different bus now, not just because of his new look, but he now works on the main line route and has made good friends amongst the bigger engines. He's still full of his own ideas, as most young buses would be, but I'm happy to say that his ideas are really useful ones indeed.
After Percy left to help build a new harbor, Duck was left to manage the yards alone. He did so easily, and made everything run like clockwork. The freight cars behaved well. The coaches sang happily, and the passengers didn't complain. One morning, Duck had brought James's coaches to the platform. He had just started to shunt Henry's freight cars when the yardmaster ran over. One of James's coaches had had a hot axle box. Can you fetch another, please? Certainly, sir, replied Duck, and he puffed doodily away to the carriage shed. He soon arrived. The big mainline coaches stood in long lines, but James was pulling smaller red coaches, so Duck had to puff into the back of the shed. He had rarely been in so far. I must sort this place out, he thought to himself. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted. Hello, called a weak voice. Duck jumped. Who was that? He gasped. Oh no, yes, dear, came the quiet reply. Duck squinted into the darkness. There, standing tucked far at the back of the shed behind big express coaches, stood three little old coaches. They had wooden bodies and shabby paintwork. Goodness me, puffed Duck. I didn't know you lot were back here. No one does, sighed one coach. They've all forgotten about us, whispered another. We've been here since that little green engine put us here, finished the third. That must have been Percy, Duck smiled. Just how long have you been in here? It's been years, they all said in unison. Duck felt sorry for them. Oh, I am sorry. Perhaps I could get you out again sometime. Oh, no, cried the coaches together. We're out of date now. They never want to keep us. They'd have us scrapped. Duck was aghast. Nonsense. It's true, said the frontmost coach. Just look at us. There's no need for us now. Not with all the nice new coaches you have now. Duck hated to admit it, But they were right. Even the coaches he'd come to collect was nicer than the old ones, and there were plenty of these new ones. "I'm sorry, my dears," sighed Duck. "I wish I could help you." "It's all right," murmured the coaches. "At least we're safe here." Duck suddenly remembered why he was there. Apologizing, he puffed out of the sheds, wondering how he could help the coaches. James was waiting crossly for him at the platform. "So much for your Western way. Where have you been?" he grumbled. "I'm sorry, James," said Duck, and he explained about the coaches. "I do wish I could help them." James laughed. "What, those old things? Forget it, they're roots." Duck scowled at James before he puffed away back to his work. But for the rest of the day, he kept thinking about the coaches. Surely they might be needed somewhere, he thought to himself. But try as he might, he couldn't think of anything. The big engines looked on with quiet amusement as Duck set about his work.
"It's silly, really," said Gordon. "But then, he is a little engine after all." "At least it keeps him quiet,"
sniggered Henry. Edward puffed past, eyeing the big engines as he went. "Those engines aren't picking on you, are they, Duck?" he asked. Duck was surprised. "What? Oh, no, Edward." "Then why the long face?" Duck sighed and explained the situation. "I do feel sorry for them," he sighed. Edward gave a comforting smile. "Well, it's very kind of you to think about them, Duck. I'm sure they'd appreciate that." "Thank you, Edward, but I don't feel that's—" Duck suddenly stopped. "Edward, you're it!" "I'm it?" The old engine was rather puzzled. "Yes, of course," smiled Duck. "Couldn't they run on your line? You don't have many coaches. Having spares might be handy." Edward smiled. "Oh yes, I could." "You could maybe even run special vintage trains, seeing as you are quite old, begging your pardon." Edward had to laugh at that. "I think that's a splendid idea, Duck. I suggest it to Sir Topham Hatt." Duck did so. Sir Topham Hatt thought it was a grand idea. The old coaches sat sad and alone, tucked away at the back of the shed, when suddenly— "Hello again," smiled Duck as he was coupled up. "What's happening?" cried the coaches, fear creeping into their voices. "Oh, don't you worry," comforted Duck. "There's no cause for alarm. We found a new place for you all," he excitedly explained. The coaches were touched. "Thank you, dear," they smiled. Duck grinned in return. "Now let's get you all to the works." The coaches were soon restored to their former glory, and they now lived at Edward Station. And every weekend, Edward takes them out on special trains. The coaches love their new life, and Duck is very pleased to have helped them find their new purpose. It was a dark and stormy night on the island of Sodor. The engines sat in their sheds, listening to the fierce wind and clapping of thunder echo above them. None of the mainline engines could sleep that night. The noise from outside kept them all awake. Percy had been shunting trucks in the yards at the big station before the storm hit, so he was ordered to stay with the big engines that night. There was a huge flash of lightning, which made poor Percy jump. Henry couldn't help but tease him.
"Be careful in the morning with it, Percy. We wouldn't want you falling off any quays or sinking in any floods again,"
Henry snickered, as did the other engines. "Be quiet," Percy snapped. "We all know you're the one who's afraid of rain, Henry." But Percy's remark was drowned by laughter. It was Gordon who spoke next, once he had recovered from chuckling.
"You know it, Percy. While I do congratulate you on getting your passengers home during the flood, a big engine like me wouldn't have been stopped. I'd be far taller than the water levels, and my fire would be unaffected. I certainly wouldn't have had to take my guards floorboards." Another chorus of laughter below from the shed. Percy huffed and shut his eyes begrudgingly. The following morning, the engines were relieved to see the storm hadn't caused too much damage. While he was being steamed, an inspector came up to Percy's cab. "The Bodford and Sons power station on the Peel Godred line had a blackout during the storm. We need you to take a repair crew on the double," said the inspector. "Right away, mate," answered Percy's driver. "I don't understand why they send such a small engine for such an urgent job. Surely a big engine is more suited for an important rescue operation like this," huffed James. "You ought to have your own trains to pull. Not to mention some of you will be too big for the branch. Percy is the ideal size for this job," remarked the inspector. The big engines grumbly watched as Percy set off for the power station. Percy hadn't ventured down the Peel Godred line before. He liked taking in all the new sights as he puffed along with his repair train. Soon they arrived at the power station. The men exited the coach and went inside to work. Percy yawned as he looked up at the early morning sky. "Perhaps I could catch a few winks here," he said quietly as he closed his eyes. Suddenly, there was a whistle and the sound of small wheels whirring. Percy jumped and saw a little purple engine puffing alongside the power station with a line of coal trucks. "Morning," peeped the little engine as he rushed by. Percy was still very surprised and forgot to answer. A few minutes later, the engine puffed back and stopped by Percy. "Hello there. Sorry if I give you a fright. It's been rather hectic here. Blackouts cause a lot of problems, you see," the little engine smiled. "That's all right. My name is Percy. What's yours?" "Little Barford's the name. Keeping Sodor shining is my game," chuckled little Barford. Percy couldn't help but giggle too. "I've never seen you before. You're as small as the engines on the Scully Railway," said Percy. "I may be small, but I have a very important job, I'll have you know," said little Barford sternly. "Without me, there'd be no coal for the power station, and then there'd be no power for the island." Percy was very impressed. "Where do you get your coal?" "There was a transfer yard further down my line. Once a month, a big engine like you brings a large shipment of coal, and it's loaded into my trucks. I bring them down here and keep the others in sidings for later." Percy blushed and smiled. Nobody had called him a big engine before. Then a whirring noise came from the power station, and it was soon up and running again. "Looks like we're back in business, which means I better get back to work," chuffed little Barford. "I do hope I can see you again soon," said Percy, as the men climbed back into the coach. Little Barford gave a friendly peep of his whistle as he set off down his little line. Percy whistled back as he puffed away. That night, Percy was stationed back in the mainline sheds as he'd be taking the post train later that night. "Well, little Percy, how did your rescue operation go? Didn't run into any back-end signals on Peel Godred, did you?" teased James. But Percy didn't answer. He just chuckled quietly to himself. "You know," Percy puffed, "next time you mainline engines look up at the lights in your shed, just remember there was a little engine out there who's working hard to make sure it stays on." The mainline engines didn't know what Percy meant. But we know better, don't we? Toby the Tram Engine was amazed. There, standing before him, was the legendary old warrior. Thomas had scared Toby by telling him it was a ghost, but in reality,
It was a little engine called Bertram, who turned out to be very friendly. "Just wait until I tell the others about this," laughed Toby. Later the next morning, he met Thomas at the station. "So, the old warrior didn't hunt you down last night then?" Thomas teased. "Quite the opposite," replied Toby excitedly. "I actually found him. He's a little old engine called Bertram, not a ghost." Thomas just laughed. "Really, Toby? Trying to use my own tale against me? You might fool Percy, but you have to wake up earlier to trick me." Thomas had heard the legend of the old warrior from his driver, and thought it nothing more than silly make-believe. Nothing Toby could say managed to convince Thomas about Bertram's authenticity. It didn't help that Bertram had been sent to the works, leaving Thomas unable to see him for himself. It was a few weeks later when Toby's driver woke him excitedly. "Wake up, Toby! We've had a special delivery to take to the mines." Toby was excited, especially when he finally saw what it was. "Bertram! How nice it is to see you again," he beamed. "You look very smart now." "I feel like a young engine again," Bertram croaked. "It's a shame I don't sound it." He still sounded rather hoarse from his years in isolation. As they made their way to the mines, Toby explained all that had happened in Bertram's absence, including Thomas's lack of belief. When he finished, Bertram laughed. "Thinks I'm still a legend, does he? What fun! He'll certainly have a shock when he does sees me. Just think of the look on his face." It was then Toby had an idea. That evening, Thomas arrived at the mines with the last supply train. "We're here on guard tonight, lad. Vat controller's orders," called the driver. Thomas was cross. He wanted to be back in his warm shed, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Night quickly fell, and Thomas was still grumpy, but he couldn't help but feel slightly uneasy. "It's that Toby filling my smokebox with that silly legend," he muttered to himself. He was just starting to relax when suddenly, "Thomas! Thomas!" Thomas froze. A chill ran through his boiler as a ghostly cackle echoed around him. Who's there?" he stammered, trying to sound as brave as he could. "I've come to get you, Thomas," wailed the voice. "You should have believed." Suddenly, a shrill whistle cried out. Poor Thomas was so frightened, he shot back right into the buffers. Oh, goodness me," chuckled Bertram in his poor old voice. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." Thomas' eyes shot open. There, beside him, were Toby and Bertram, with innocent grins on their faces. Thomas then burst out laughing. "Oh, you win, Toby. I was a silly engine to not believe you. It's very nice to meet you, old warrior," he added happily. "As it is to meet you," Bertram smiled. "I hope I didn't scare you too much." Everyone laughed before the three engines began to chat happily away like old friends.